Charles Darwin's key to perfect health. You see, Charles Darwin, who's famous for popularizing his theory of evolution, said, "We must acknowledge that man, with all his noble qualities, still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin." To put it more simply, what he's saying that, yes, we've evolved so much to create these amazing societies we now live in, but it's not wise to ignore where we came from evolutionarily. From a health perspective, here's why it's important. David Lieberman, who wrote the book The Story of the Human Body, said this: "Our society's general failure to think about human evolution is a major reason we fail to prevent preventable diseases. Our bodies have a story, an evolutionary story, that matters intensely. For one, evolution explains why our bodies are the way they are, and thus yields clues on how to avoid getting sick." It seems so obvious, but it's so easily ignored in our world. I know I never thought of this growing up. Because instead of thinking in terms of evolution, doctors think in terms of chemicals. And instead of selling us nature, companies sell us fake processed food and spend millions of dollars making us think it's healthy. Instead of thinking, does this make sense evolutionarily, we're trained to think if it makes sense based on what we're taught or what conventional wisdom tells us, which isn't always the same. Think of this. I remember growing up, we were taught about the food pyramid, which is the US government's recommendation on food in school. And at the bottom of the pyramid is grains, things like wheat and bread and cereals and pasta. But when you think of that from an evolutionary perspective, agriculture was invented only about 12,000 years ago. But it's taken our bodies millions of years to become what they've become. So to say that that should be the basis of what we eat doesn't make any sense. Or we're taught how fats are bad for us. And yes, a lot of the fake fats that these big food companies make are bad for us. But evolutionarily, our brains are made up of mostly fat. So a low-fat diet isn't necessarily the healthiest thing you can do. Or even excessive cardio, like jogging all the time. There's actually a lot of evidence that shows us that it isn't really the best form of exercise. And I think that makes sense considering the fact that our ancestors probably did a lot of walking, but they also probably weren't jogging for extremely long distances 5 days a week. Now, my goal here isn't to give you specific health advice, but just to share this mindset shift with you. And to remind you that what we're taught is healthy most of the time has the agenda of big companies and marketers in mind. So instead of focusing on packages and claims like gluten-free, it makes more sense to do what Sean Stevenson of the Model Health Show says. He says if you were going to show what you're about to eat to a group of hunter-gatherers who have been living in the forest since birth, would they recognize it? For example, they would recognize an apple or a piece of meat. But most of what we eat, they probably wouldn't recognize. So the real key is to eat real food. So I encourage you when it comes to health, listen to doctors. But first and foremost, ask yourself, does this make sense from an evolutionary perspective? And more importantly, rather than jumping on new age health claims like gluten-free, it's better to ask yourself if it even makes sense to be eating that much bread and grains in the first place. And instead of jumping to prescriptions to fix our problems, first try going back to evolution. Remember that most health problems come not from doing what your doctor says, they come from ignoring our evolutionary past. So eat real food and exercise in an evolutionarily friendly way. Let nature be your key to health rather than science. And by the way, if you want to learn more about our evolutionary past, I recommend Lieberman's book, The Story of the Human Body. And if you want to learn more about health, I recommend Sean Stevenson's podcast, The Model Health Show. Anyway, I hope this was helpful because it's been such a powerful shift for me to think in these terms, and I hope it's helpful for you as well.